Hello everybody, welcome to Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH, and today we will be discussing part 2 of the Conceptual Framework for Financial Reporting, second lesson for our series for Conceptual Framework and Accounting Standards. Let's start. So in our previous lesson, we have already discussed the scope and purpose of the conceptual framework. We're also done with Chapter 1, the objective of general purpose financial reporting, and Chapter 2, qualitative characteristics of useful financial information. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 3, financial statements and the reporting entity, and Chapter 4, the elements of financial statements. Okay, sige po, start na po tayo. Let's start with Chapter 3, Financial Statements and the Reporting Entity. According to the framework, financial statements provide information about economic resources of the reporting entity, claims against the entity, and changes in those resources and claims that meet the definitions of the elements of financial statements. So kung galing na kayo sa medyo basic accounting na klase before your CFAS class, you already know the different elements of financial statements, at least on a very easy perspective, no? Or kung galing na kayo in senior high school, you have gone through all of these na. So, alam ko naman na alam nyo na yung elements of financial statements. Although, we have to have a much more deeper appreciation, basically a theoretical foundation of what these elements of financial statements are, and specifically those economic resources, claims against the entity, and changes in those resources. So malalaman natin siya isa-isa na yun pala yung tinutukoy na economic resource, yun pala yung claims na yun, yung changes in those resources. Ang gusto nating i-point out here is that the framework tells us that financial statements provide information, which goes back to the actual purpose of accounting, of providing financial information that will be helpful for decision making. Now, a more formal definition of financial statements will be provided to you when we tackle IAS 1 presentation of financial statements. So, relax lang muna tayo. Okay? Sige po. Objective and scope of financial statements. The objective of financial statements is to provide financial information tungkol saan the reporting entities, assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses. Yun po yung main 5 items na tinutukoy natin as the elements of financial statements. Now, the objective, again, of financial statements is to provide financial information about those elements that is useful to users of financial statements in assessing the prospects for future net cash inflows. So basically, ina-assess po natin yung kakayahan ng isang entity into generating future net cash inflows to the reporting entity, and also yung pong lagi din natin sinasabi also in the last video, which is assessing management stewardship. Paano po ba nila napangalagaan at napangasiwaan ang mga economic resources na in-entrust sa kanila. So basically, the objective of financial statements is to provide financial information about these elements para po makatulong in assessing the prospects for future net cash inflows of the reporting entity and assessing the management stewardship of the entity's economic resources. That's what the framework tells us. Now, where do we find those information? Paano po ba, no? So, the complete set of financial statements will be discussed with you in IAS 1 presentation of financial statements. But as a starting point, syempre gagamitin natin yung framework. The framework tells us the following. Okay, so where to find those information? The first one is the entity's statement of financial position, which reports the entity's assets, liabilities, and equity. And then we also have statements of financial performance, which reports the entity's income and expenses. Kaya po pag sinabing income and expenses, yun po yung entity's financial performance. However, if you will notice here, para sa inyo baka wala lang ito, pero may meaning po yan kung bakit may open-close parenthesis yung S. Kasi po, the statements of financial performance, which is represented by the income statement, when we go to IAS 1 presentation of financial statements, meron po tayong income statement at saka statement of comprehensive income na pwedeng two-statement format na separated or isang buo na compact na kung tawagin po natin ay statement of comprehensive income. Now, the framework is not clear kung ano po ba yung tinutukoy niya dito. Pero pagdating po natin sa IAS 1, we will be exploring the difference between a single statement, comprehensive income, and a two-statement format which has a separate income statement and then meron ka pang separate uli na statement of comprehensive income. The point here is we're talking about income and expenses when we say financial performance. Okay? I just want you to be detailed oriented also on those things because it will help you in answering accounting examinations when you're being detail oriented. Okay? And then the next one is other statements and notes. So hindi po iniisa-isa yung mga alam nyo pang ibang statements, no, financial statements, pero nandyan na rin yan, no? So presenting and disclosing information about the following: recognize assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses, including information about their nature, about the risk arising from those recognized assets and liabilities. Saan mo makikita yan? Siyempre, explanatory yan, so nasa notes to financial statements. And then, assets and liabilities that have not been recognized, see including information about their nature and about the risk arising from them. So, notes din yan. And then, siyempre, cash flow. Statement of cash flows, di ba? Contributions from holders of equity claims and distributions to them. So, kung equity ang pinag-uusapan, statement of changes in equity. And then, the methods, assumptions, and judgments used in estimating the amounts presented or disclosed and changes in those methods, assumptions, and judgments also can be seen in the notes to financial statements. Okay? So, yun po yung mismong scope of financial statements. But again, we will be discussing them in detail in IAS 1 presentation of financial statements. Now, let's talk about the entity's reporting period. Gaano po ba kahaba yung pagre-report natin ng isang financial statement? In your basic accounting classes, it was already mentioned to you that financial statements should report financial reports or prepare financial statements or report them at least annually. Although hindi po directly sinabi yan dito kasi madidiscuss pa po natin yan in a different standard, which is yun nga po, ulitin ko na naman, nasa IAS 1 din. Okay? But the framework tells us that financial statements should be prepared for a specified period of time. Ibig sabihin, kailangan klaro tayo. Ano po ba yung specified period of time na pinapatungkulan nung mga items na nire-report natin? Okay, and then, what information shall be presented in those financial statements? Basically, we go back to that again. The entity's assets and liabilities, including unrecognized assets and liabilities, and basically on the notes. And equity that existed at the end of the reporting period or during the reporting period. And income and expenses for the specific reporting period. Kasi alam nyo naman po natin, pag nasa financial position tayo, as at that year end or that period end. Pero kapag ka income and expenses, yun lang mismong period na yun for the year ended. Okay? But we go back to that on IAS 1 para klaro sa inyo. To help users of financial statements to identify and assess changes and trends, financial statements also provide comparative information. Kung matatandaan po ninyo, sabi po natin, comparability is an enhancing qualitative characteristic of useful financial information. So dito po, kapag ka nagre-report po tayo ng financial statements, we should also provide comparative information for at least at a minimum, one preceding reporting period. So what does that mean? If you are reporting for December 31, 2022, you should also present information for December 31, 2021, at least one preceding reporting period. Comparative. In short, 2022 at saka 2021 sabay mong i-present so that you can provide comparative information. Although, syempre, nung sa basic accounting classes po ninyo, hindi pa ganun ka-comparative kasi you're just learning pa the accounting process eh. Konyo. You're just learning pa the accounting process eh. So So, nasa recording process pa lang kayo until you do the trial balance and the adjustments and worksheets and FS. So, understandable, no? Don't be too hard on yourself. For now, kung hindi pa kayo marunong comparative FS, nasa theoretical side pa lang naman tayo. Na sinasabi ng framework that you should also provide as an accountant and when you prepare the FS, comparative information, and the minimum requirement is at least one preceding reporting period. Yun po yun. Okay? Don't be too harsh on yourself. Aabot po kayo dun. Financial statements include information about transactions and other events that have occurred after the end of the reporting period if providing that information is necessary to meet the objective of financial statements. Yes po, pwede rin po yun. Ang tawag po doon, events after the reporting period. If my memory serves me right, pag-uusapan din po natin yan sa IAS 10, events after the reporting period. So, sinabi lang po ng framework, again, don't be too harsh on yourself, dadaanan din po natin yan. Okay? Events after the reporting period. Perspective adopted in financial statements. Kaninong perspektibo po ba, no? Yung pinapatungkulan ng financial statements. Tungkol kanino? Sino ang main character? Okay? Financial statements provide information about transactions and other events viewed from the perspective of the reporting entity as a whole. Sila mismo, no? The perspective of the reporting entity. The entity itself, di ba? Hi, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me. Ganun yun, okay? Siya mismo, no? The reporting entity itself. And the framework is very clear about this. It's not on the perspective of any particular group of entities existing or potential investors, lenders, and other creditors. In short, the main character is the entity itself. Yun lang yun. Okay, so that's the perspective adopted in financial statements. Let's now go to going concern. Ano po ba yung sinasabi na going concern principle? Malamang naman po sa basic accounting classes po ninyo na-discuss na yan na we are preparing financial statements on a perspective that the entity is a going concern. And when we say going concern, it will continue in operation for the foreseeable future na iisipin natin, it will not close forever. Ganun po yun. Okay? So we prepare these financial statements on the assumption that the reporting entity is a going concern. Hence, it is assumed that the entity has neither the intention nor the need to enter liquidation or cease trading. In short, when we prepare and present these financial statements, ang nasa isip po natin is that the entity is a going concern. They don't have any intention to liquidate. They don't have any intention to cease trading. If such an intention or need exists, kung sakali man pong nagbabago ang panahon, iniisip na nilang magsara, or meron pong ibang intention yung pagre-report ng mga financial statements natin, kailangan po natin siya, number one, the FS should be prepared on a different basis, on the basis of liquidation. Ganon. Kung ganun man po ang mangyayari, the framework tells us, describe that basis use. Explain, no, yung basis na ginamit mo. Okay? Yun po yun. Okay, now, we've always been trying to talk about what reporting entity is. And ano po ba yung sinasabi nating reporting entity? Sinabi ko naman na sa inyo yan kung sino yung reporting entity in the last video. But formally, in the framework, sinabi naman din talaga. Para lang clear tayo, para sure tayo, a reporting entity is an entity that is required or chooses to prepare financial statements. Eh di yung main character. The entity itself. The reporting entity can be a single entity or a portion of an entity or can comprise more than one entity. All of those are possible. Okay? A reporting entity is not necessarily actually a legal entity. Pero hindi po sinasabi na pwede illegal lang. Hindi yun. Don't put it on that perspective. Hindi po yun. When you say legal entity kasi, legal entity as to yung ibang, hindi ko ma-explain baka magkamali rin ako, pero iwanan muna natin siguro yung word na legal entity. I'm leaving that to you for now. Pero wag nyo po siyang i-put on the perspective na the reporting entity is not necessarily a legal entity, so the entity can also be an illegal entity. Don't put it like that, please. I'm not teaching you that, okay? Baka ikasira natin yan na ating channel. De, joke lang. Pero yun po, don't put it please on that perspective. That's not the interpretation for that. But when we say reporting entity, that's the main character, the entity that is required or chooses to prepare the financial statements, which can be a single entity, a portion of an entity, or an entity that can comprise more than one entity. That's possible. Sir, how can that be possible? Ito na po. Sige, isa-isahin natin. Sometimes, one entity, which is called the parent entity, has control over another entity, which is what we call subsidiary. A parent has a control over a subsidiary. Sir, paano po yung yung perspective na yan? So, let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, that the parent company is SM Investments Corporation. So, marami siyang subsidiaries. SM Retail, and then BDO. Yan, mga subsidiary companies niya yan. So, one entity controls another entity. Yun po yung tinatawag nating parent-subsidiary relationship. No? If a reporting entity comprises both the parent and its subsidiaries, the reporting entity's financial statements are referred to as consolidated financial statements. Ibig sabihin po, when we prepare financial statements na magkasama po yung parent at subsidiary in one financial statement, then that is what we call consolidated financial statements. Sir, gagawin na po ba natin talaga agad yan? No. You will do that maybe on your third year. Accounting for special transactions? No. Accounting for business combinations, rather. I'm sorry. Kasi nagbago na yung titles and subjects nyo, so medyo nalito na ako. So, pag-aaralan nyo po yan around mga second or usually third year. Consolidated financial statements, paano po maggawa ng FS on a parent-subsidiary relationship, yung mga ganyang mergers and acquisitions and stuff. Relax, nasa theoretical framework portion pa lang po tayo, at least may idea na kayo, ang tawag po doon, consolidated financial statements. That's under IFRS 3, business combinations, and IFRS 10, consolidated financial statements, which you will all be learning in accounting for business combinations in your third year. Nasa advanced accounting po yun na side, no? Hindi pa dito, relax. This is just theoretical, okay? And then, if a reporting entity is the parent alone, the reporting entity's financial statements are referred to as unconsolidated financial statements. Maybe we can also call it separate financial statements. There's also an accounting standard for that na madadaanan natin, IAS 27 separate financial statements. But the totality of the discussion on consolidated and separate financial statements will be discussed with you in accounting for business combinations. Okay? So, yun. So, if the parent alone reports the financial statements, ang tawag po dun is unconsolidated financial statements. Now, there are also cases that a reporting entity comprises two or more entities that are not all linked by a parent-subsidiary relationship. So, hindi po yun yung relationship nila, but it's somewhat comprised of two or more entities. In that case, that is called a combined financial statement. Okay? So, yun po yung sinasabi nating reporting entity, yung sinasabi nating main character. Who's the main character in these financial reports? That is what we call the reporting entity, which may be single entity, a part only of the entity, or two or more entities. Consolidated FS, unconsolidated or separated FS, or your combined FS, all of those. FSS are pertaining to whom? Whom talaga, no? Tao, ginawang tao. Pertaining to what? The reporting entity, which is what we call the main character. Okay? Yan po yun. Now, consolidated and unconsolidated financial statements. Let's talk about them more. Consolidated financial statements provide information about the assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses of both the parent and subsidiaries, and ang presentation sa kanya para lang silang isang company. Okay? Ganun po siya. You present the entity's assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses of both the parent and subsidiaries as if they are a single reporting entity. Okay? Consolidated financial statements are not designed to provide separate information about the assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses of any particular subsidiary. Kasi, mga kapatid, kung mako-curious kayo, type nyo, Jollibee Foods Corporation Consolidated Financial Statements. Magkakasama na po si Jollibee tsaka yung mga iba niyang subsidiaries na hindi ko napapangalanan kasi baka mag-commercial na ako dito. Pero masasarap din naman yon, di ba? Alam natin yon, no? Pero kasi when you see consolidated financial statements, it looks like it's only one entity kasi eh, 'di ba? It's prepared as if there are only one lang. So yung sinasabi natin dito, the consolidated financial statements are not designed to provide separate information about the elements of financial statements of any particular subsidiary. Ang consolidated financial statements po, hindi po yan naka-table na company A, company B, company C. No, it's not like that. They are being consolidated. Kaya nga po consolidated yung word, naka-total lahat yan as if you are reporting only a single entity. Now, sir, I'm curious about the FS of the subsidiary. Where can I see it? Ito po, a subsidiary's own financial statements are designed to provide that information. May sariling FS din naman po yung subsidiary na hindi nakapasok dun sa consolidated part. No, they report syempre din yung kanilang financial statements. Meron po silang financial statements of their own. So, na hindi nakakapasok nga dun sa consolidation. So, a subsidiary's own financial statements are designed to provide that information for you. Now, unconsolidated financial statements are designed to provide information about the parent's assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses na hindi po kasama naman yung subsidiary part ng mga FSS. So, it's the parent's FS. Yun lang. Parent company financial statements. Ganun lang. Hindi siya consolidated. Sila lang. Okay? Now, another way to provide information, the framework tells us about or some or all of the assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses of the parent alone if you're just really curious about the parent. Pwede po siyang yung mismong consolidated FS tapos meron ka lang explanatory notes sa dulo. In a way to provide information for some or all of the assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses of the parent alone if you're really just curious about the parent company. Okay? Pwede rin po siyang nasa consolidated FS pero nire-report sa notes. Specific for the parent. Okay. That's it. And we go now to chapter 4, the elements of financial statements. Actually, these things are already something that you know, but let's put ourselves in a very theoretical perspective how it's being discussed and described in the conceptual framework. So you'll have a deeper appreciation of what these elements of financial statements are. Para hindi kayo pag tinanong ng what is an asset? An asset are the things of value owned by the business. Pang ano yun? Pang understandable yun on a senior high level. But on an undergraduate level, a college student level, parang hindi na acceptable sa akin kung tatanungin ko kayo at sasagutin nyo ko ng things of value owned by the business, yung asset. Wag nang ganon. So, itataas natin yung level nyo. Okay? So, listen carefully. How do we properly define an asset as an accountancy student or as an accounting major? No? Na nasa kolehiyo, no? Pang-college yung dating ng inyong explanation, yung inyong definition. Okay? That's a good starting point, pero itataas natin yung kalidad nung pagsagot nyo sa professors nyo. Okay? The elements of financial statements defined in the conceptual framework are assets, liabilities, and equity, which relate to the company's financial position, and income and expenses, which relate to a company's or reporting entity's financial performance. In short, when we say financial position, the big three: assets, liabilities, and equity. And then financial performance, the magkapatid, income and expenses. Ganun lang. Okay? Now, the conceptual framework for financial reporting gave us a summary table about the elements of financial statements and how do we properly define them. So we will be going through this table and then we will be dissecting them in detail one by one. So let's go through this table first. Now, the item discussed in chapter 1, not the chapter 1 of any textbook that you have, that's chapter 1 of the conceptual framework, economic resource. When we say economic resource, that refers to the entity's asset. An asset is a present economic resource controlled by the entity as a result of past events. It is an economic resource. Basically, an economic resource, rather, is a right that has the potential to produce economic benefits. Bakit po siya sinabing present economic resource? It's presently owned by the entity and it's presently controlled by the entity. And you have those assets, you have those assets as a result of past events. Now, when we say economic resource, it is a right that has the potential, basically those resources that you have, the entity has, the assets that the entity has the potential to produce economic benefits that the entity can enjoy. Okay? So that is an asset. So ganyan yun na po isasagot ang definition ng asset. An asset, according to the conceptual framework for financial reporting, is a present economic resource controlled by the entity as a result of past events. And then you can just add the thing that you know, on a much more simple explanation, an asset are things of value owned by the business that can help them produce economic benefits. O di ba mas maganda na yung pagsagot nyo sa professors nyo pag tinanong kayo kung ano na yung asset. Okay? Taas na natin yung level kasi nasa college na kayo. Okay? Now, we go to the claims. Ito po yung mga claims na sinasabi. Ano ba yung claims na yon? Claims as to liability and claims na equity. Now, a liability is a present obligation of the entity to transfer an economic resource as a result of past events. So, it's a present obligation. Dahil may nangyari ding past event, kaya may nag-arise na present obligation, which is magre-result siya sa transfer of economic resource from your entity to another entity. Okay? Meanwhile, equity means the residual interest in the assets of the entity after deducting all its liabilities. On a basic accounting perspective na tinuro sa inyo sa senior high, it's like equity is the rights of the owner and the assets of the business. Yun yung sinasabi. When you say rights of the owner and the assets of the business, the residual interest in the assets of the entity in case we deduct all of the entity's liabilities. That's equity. And that's the capital that you know in basic accounting. Okay? Now, we also have the changes in economic resources and claims which reflects financial performance, which is income and expenses. Income is increases in assets or decreases in liabilities that result in increases in equity, pero hindi daw po siya transactions that relates to contributions from holders of equity claims. Ibig sabihin, hindi siya equity transaction diretso. No, they are increases in assets or decreases in liabilities that result in increases in equity. Now, the definition is a bit vague in terms of yung pagre-render ng services or selling goods to customers, pero that's the income that you know, and that's how an entity will be able to increase their assets, decrease their liabilities that will result in an increase in equity. Kumbaga, the framework definition is much more of the effect, but how will that really happen? That's the thing that you know, which is income is, selling goods to your customers, rendering services for them, and that's how you get the income. That's the method. That's how you get revenues. That's how you get income. But specifically speaking about the a definition in the framework, ito po yung sinasabi sa atin. The framework defines it more of the effect in the other elements rather than what really income is on its motivational part for the entity. Bakit nga ba sila nag-open ng business? Basically, that's the motivational part, right? To gain income. Pero the framework gives us more of the result as its definition. Okay? while expenses includes decreases in assets, increases in liabilities that result in decreases in equity. But this is other than those transactions that relates to distributions to holders of equity claims like dividends, ganon. So, hindi daw po siya yung parang dividends na nagkakaroon distributions to equity claims, mga ganon. And these are also the expenses that you know in your basic accounting. Salaries expense, rent expense, depreciation expense, no? Those are the kinds of expenses that you know, and yun din naman yun. Again, it's just that the framework gives us a definition more about the effect of those activities. Okay? So, yun po yun. And then, wala pong specific terminology, but also, the framework gives us other changes in economic resources and claims, like contributions from holders of equity claims and distributions to them, which can be presented in your statement of changes in equity, and exchanges of assets and liabilities that do not result in increases or decreases in equity. So, ibang bagay na po yan. Hindi po pinangalanan ng mabuti ng framework, but you will go through them and learn them one by one. But not now. Okay? Sige po. Let's now talk about assets. An asset is a so ulit. I'm sorry, give me chance again. Ulit. Okay. An asset is a present economic resource controlled by the entity as a result of past events. An economic resource is a right that has the potential to produce economic benefits. It's something that you're using now, and you control it now as an entity as a result of past events. Nagkaroon ka ng asset na yun kasi may previous transaction na nangyari. Para magkaroon ka ng asset na yun. You will not have an equipment if you don't buy that equipment. But that equipment, when used accordingly, depending on the nature of the entity's business, it's a present economic resource that you control in order for you to gain potential economic benefits with the use of that asset. Okay? Now, the three aspects of those economic resources or asset is, number one, the entity has the right, the potential to produce economic benefits, and control. So, let's talk about those three aspects one by one. Right. Rights that correspond to an obligation of another. Ibig sabihin, minsan kasi kapag may asset ka, obligation siya ng ibang entity sa iyo. For example, rights to receive cash. Nagbenta ka ng product sa customer, so you have the right to receive cash. Receivable siya, di ba? So asset na siya by itself, receivable. When you have the right to receive cash and it really becomes cash in the future, naka-receive ka ng cash, hindi ba? But the right itself to receive cash is an obligation of the other entity who bought that goods from you, di ba? Obligation niya na magbayad sa'yo. So ang nangyayari is, sometimes, your right for something is an obligation of another entity. That's what the framework tells us. Okay? Another thing is rights to receive goods and services. Rights to exchange economic resources with another party on favorable terms. Such rights include a forward contract to buy an economic resource on terms that are currently favorable, or an option to buy an economic resource. Don't stress yourself on this part. This is a little advanced accounting. We'll be toning it down. We'll be pausing that a little for now. So, medyo, muna tayo. Relax lang tayo dyan. No? Binasa ko lang. And also, rights to benefit from an obligation of another party to transfer an economic resource if a specified uncertain future event occurs. Okay? Now, rights that do not correspond to an obligation of another party. So, meron ka rin namang mga karapatan. The entity also has karapatan to use those assets na hindi naman po represented by an obligation of another entity. For example, rights over physical objects like your PPE, property, plant, and equipment, or inventories. Okay? Examples of such rights are a right to use a physical object or a right to benefit from the residual value of a leased object. So, later on, we will be discussing IAS 16, property, plant, and equipment, and IAS 2, inventories. So, relax lang tayo. But, as you know, those are kinds of assets as well, no? That the entity has a right over them naman din. Okay? And then also the rights to use intellectual property. There are also different intellectual properties that we will be discussing under IAS 38, intangible assets, kung di ako nagkakamali. IAS 38. Okay, so yun. Next is an asset's potential to produce economic benefits. Na habang minamaximize mo yung paggamit mo ng assets, syempre, ang ine-expect natin is it has the potential to produce economic benefits. An economic resource is a right that has the potential to produce economic benefits. For that potential to exist, it does not need to be certain or even likely that the right will produce economic benefits. Basta merong potential to produce economic benefits for the entity. That's it. Yung sinasabing potential na yun. Okay? It is only necessary that the right already exists and that, in at least one circumstance, it would produce for the entity economic benefits beyond those available to all other parties. Which means that the framework is very specific about those economic benefits should be exclusively enjoyed by the entity itself, not available to all other parties. Kaya nga sinabi dito, economic benefits beyond those available to all other parties, which means that exclusive to the entity. Okay? An economic resource could produce economic benefits for an entity by entitling it or enabling it to do one of the following. For example, receive contractual cash flows or another economic resource, exchange economic resources with another party on favorable terms, produce cash inflows or avoid cash outflows using economic resources either individually or in combination with other economic resources, using the economic resource to enhance the value of other economic resources, receiving cash or other economic resources by selling the economic resource or extinguishing liabilities by transferring the economic resource. Lahat po yan, pag binasa nyong mabuti, are just representations of the business transactions that we record in accounting. Okay? It's just that they are being described in the framework as something that how to relate it to that element of the FS. But as you read them one by one and you analyze, and I'm leaving the analysis to you, these are just actually business transactions that you already actually know. Okay? So, pagalawin ng isip dun sa mga binanggit natin dito, pero yun po yung tinutukoy doon. Okay? Let's talk about control. Ano po ba yung sinasabing third aspect ng asset na control? An entity controls an economic resource if it has the present ability to direct the use of the economic resource and obtain the benefits that may flow from it. So, siya yung may karapatang gumamit ng economic resource na yon at yung entity rin ang may karapatan to obtain the economic benefits that will flow from using that economic resource. Control includes the present ability to prevent other parties from directing the use of the economic resource. Sabi ko nga sa inyo, may exclusivity siya sa entity lang mismo, and from obtaining the economic benefits that may flow from it. It follows that if one party controls an economic resource, no other party controls that resource. It is specifically and exclusively for the entity only. Okay. Now, an entity has the present ability to direct the use of an economic resource if it has the right to deploy that economic resource in its activities or to allow another party to deploy the economic resource in that other party's activities. Sila pa rin ang mag-aalaw, no? Kasi sila yung may control eh, no? Sila yung may control. So, ganun pa din. They will be allowing that to happen because they have the control over it. And for an entity to control an economic resource, the future economic benefits from that resource must flow to the entity either directly or indirectly rather than to another party, which gives us also, the perspective of exclusivity that the entity should only enjoy the economic benefits that will flow from the use of those assets. Okay? Yun po yung sinasabi nating control. Okay, let's now talk about liabilities. Sabi po sa inyo na very subtle perspective sa pinakamababaw na explanasyon, liabilities are the utangs of the entity. Well, really, that's true. Okay? But, lalawakan po natin siya na there are different, kasi pag sinabi mong utang, it's very monetary in nature, that the entity has to pay back that utang. I'm not closing that fact because liability is indeed utang for some of the accounts. Pero lalawakan po natin that liabilities are obligations of the entity that will, ano ba yung effect niya? An outflow or transfer of economic resource as a result of past events. Actually, the previous definition is it's an embodiment of an outflow of economic benefits, no? But the terminologies in the definition is now changed into a transfer of economic resource. And all of this happened, and you have that present obligation also because it is a result of past events. Now, the framework tells us that there should be 3 criteria that must be satisfied for a liability to exist. So, para daw po masabi natin, ay, may liability yung entity. So, these 3 should be present. Number 1, the entity has an obligation, and the obligation is to transfer an economic resource, and the obligation is a present obligation that exists as a result of past events. Let's talk about these 3 criteria one by one. 3 criteria, 1 by 3 criterias. Criteria is also already plural. Sorry po. Okay, criteria is already plural. So let's talk about these 3 criteria. Okay. First, it should be an obligation by itself. Now, the framework tells us that an obligation is a duty or responsibility that an entity has no practical ability to avoid. So it's unavoidable. An obligation is always owed to another party. So meron other party na involved. Ako, yung mga other parties na involved na yan. Joke lang. Okay? And the other party could be a person or another entity, a group of people or other entities, or the society at large. Yon. Sir, paano yung the society at large? May utang ang company sa society? Yeah. There are actually kinds of that. No? Pero masyadong malalim pag diniscuss natin agad. Pero quick overview. Meron kasi tayong mga obligations na nag-a-arise because, kunyari, ang entity merong na pangako ng corporate social responsibility activities, no? Mga cleanup drive, ganyan-ganyan. Pagdating nyo kasi ng discussion for intermediate accounting on liabilities, meron kayong mga dapat na ina-accrue na mga liabilities na yung mga patterns of past practice ng entity, kailangan siyempre, nag-a-arise din yun. So, kailangan nag-a-accrue ka rin doon. No? So, posible din po yun. Yung mga obligations natin to a person, another entity, groups of people, other entities, or the society itself at large. Okay? Possible po yun. Depende sa transactions na pinapasok ng entity. No? But that's possible. Okay. If one party has an obligation to transfer an economic resource, it follows that another party has the right to receive that economic resource. Kaya nga merong other party na involved. However, a requirement for one party to recognize a liability and measure it at a specified amount does not imply that the other party must also recognize it as an asset at the very same amount. Yeah. Pero, hindi ko kayo mabibigyan ng very detailed na example with amounts right now. Let's just put it first on a very theoretical perspective kasi yun yung sinabi ng framework. No? Madadaanan nyo naman yan, actually not here na, but in your intermediate accounting courses. Na ay, hindi pala ganun porke yun yung ni-record cost liability, dapat asset niya ganun din. So, actually, may cases na ganun. You will learn it one by one. Not here, actually. Okay? Standards may contain different recognition criteria or measurement requirements for a liability of one party and the corresponding asset to that other party. If those different criteria or requirements are a consequence of decisions intended to select the most relevant information that faithfully represent what it purports to represent. Kaya po nangyayari yun kasi sumusunod din tayo sa quality ng useful financial information to faithfully represent, no? What it purports to present. Faithful representation po, nagbo-boil down lahat yun. Okay, that's it. And then there should be a transfer of economic resource. On a very mababaw perspective, kunyari, may liability ka kasi nag-buy ka ng nag-buy ka ng equipment and then on account, 'di ba? So may utang ka ngayon. So expected na magkakaroon ng transfer of economic resource kasi, for example, you have to pay for that liability. You have to pay for that equipment na binili mo on account. Ganun siya. Okay? The obligation must have the potential to require the entity to transfer an economic resource to another party. So if you have a liability arising from a purchase of equipment on account, the obligation of an entity na sinasabi ditong transfer of economic resource, edi syempre magbabayad siya ng cash. Babayaran niya yung entity kung saan niya binili yung equipment. Yun po yung sinasabi nating transfer of economic resource. Okay. Ano po yung examples niya? Paying cash, o hindi po kaya obligations to deliver goods or provide services. Di ba? Meron tayong mga deferred revenue na nabayaran ka na in advance, pero meron ka pang unearned revenue kasi hindi mo pa nare-render yung service. Yun yung obligation mo, di ba? Unearned service revenue kasi hindi mo pa na-perform yung service para dun sa customer mo, di ba? Obligations to exchange economic resource with another party on unfavorable terms. Ganon din, forward contracts, pang advance accounting yan. Relax muna kayo dyan. Obligations to transfer an economic resource if a specified uncertain future event occurs. And obligations to issue a financial instrument if that financial instrument will oblige the entity to transfer an economic resource. Yung mga last 3 bullets, let's leave that on advance accounting. Okay? Relax lang. Wag muna. At least you know that it's mentioned in the framework. Okay? Relax muna tayo dyan. And then, it should also be a present obligation as a result of past events. Okay? A present obligation exists as a result of past events only if the entity has already obtained economic benefits or taken an action, and as a consequence, the entity will or may have to transfer an economic resource that it would not otherwise have had to transfer. Kasi nga, it's a result of past events. That's it. Okay? Let's now go to the next part of your financial position element, which is equity. On a very mababaw perspective on your basic accounting classes, ito yung capital na sinasabi natin. Nabago naman na po ang inyong pananaw sa word na capital kasi I know that before attending your very first accounting class when you were in senior high school, you know that capital is the puhunan, the starting point of a business, 'di ba? Nabago naman na natin 'yun siguro, 'di ba, when you were in ABM, 'di ba? Pero and as you know, capital is a much more bigger perspective in accounting. It includes your initial investments and then your additional contributions by the owner, and then it's also affected by the net income and then any withdrawals by the owner. Mas lalawak pa ngayon ang inyong knowledge ng equity, more so when you enter partnership accounting, when you enter corporation accounting. So yung knowledge yun ng changes in equity talagang lalaki, and this is the starting point of that, na hindi na lang kasi on a sole proprietorship yung level na aaralin nyo as an accounting major. And I think this is the first one to tackle this, no? Kung paano pa natin palalawakin yung konsepto ng equity. Now, equity is always mentioned as the rights of the owner in the assets of the business. Totoo naman yun, after deducting all liabilities. Formally, in the framework, equity is the residual interests in the assets of an entity after deducting all its liabilities. In other words, they are claims against the entity na hindi po nire-represent ng liabilities. Parang ganito. On a sole proprietorship perspective, di ba, isipin nyo yung accounting equation, assets is equals to liabilities plus equity. Yung liabilities plus equity, sabi po natin, claims yun, di ba? So, on a sole proprietorship perspective, yung claims ng other entities sa entity na to is yung liabilities. Ngayon, yung capital na naiwan, yung equity na naiwan, yun yung sinasabi nating rights of the owner and the assets of the business. Ibig sabihin, yun din yung claims niya against the entity na hindi liability. Kasi nga, right niya yun over the assets of the business after we talk about liabilities. Yun. Pero, on a bigger perspective, hanggang papasok na kayo ng partnership accounting tsaka corporation accounting, lalo na sa corporation, di ba? In corporation accounting, yung ownership natin sa entity is divided into shares of stock. So, kapag shares of stock, may mga stockholders tayo. So, depende sa shares of stock at kung ilan yung hawak mong share sa company, yun yung ownership mo. So, yun din yung claims mo against the entity and it's not represented as a liability. It's represented as an equity. Yun po yun. Kaya sa claims din kung tutusin. They are ownership claims to explain it easily for you guys. Ownership claims, okay? Such claims may be established by contract, legislation, or similar means, and include to the extent that they do not meet the definition of a liability. It's a claim na hindi liability, yun. Shares of various types issued by the entity, like ordinary shares and preference shares when you go to corporation accounting, and some obligations of the entity to issue another equity claim. Different classes of equity claims like ordinary shares or preference shares as what I've mentioned. Sa mga hindi pa po nagko-corporation accounting, ito po yung two kinds of shares natin on corporation setup. Ordinary share capital and preference share capital. Hindi po natin yan dito pag-aaralan masyado. Sa ibang accounting courses nyo po yon. Now, kung natapos na po kayo sa inyong basic accounting at nadaanan po ninyo yung corporation, then I know what we are talking about. And I know na alam nyo na what we are talking about here. Yun po. Pero sa mga hindi pa po nagko-corporation setup ng accounting, when we say ordinary share capital and preference share capital, those are two kinds of the classes of equity on a corporation setup. Different classes of equity claims may confer on their holders different rights. For example, the rights to receive all or of the following from the entity. Rights to receive dividends if the entity decides to pay dividends to eligible holders. So for example, for those po na mga hindi pa nagko-corporation accounting, corporation to, tapos shareholder ka. Pag ang entity kumita net income, the entity can say na okay, magde-declare kami ng dividends. So may sinasabing dividends declaration. Ibig sabihin, the shareholders will get something from the income na kinita. Okay? Ganun natin siya ipuput. Ang tawag doon, dividends. Okay? And then also, the proceeds from satisfying the equity claims either in full or on liquidation or in part at other times other equity claims. Pero yung mas malalim pa po nating equity claims, lalo na kung liquidation ang pinag-uusapan, you will be talking about that on advanced accounting on the part of the lesson on corporate liquidation. Ibang level ng claims yon mga baby. Wag muna dito. Okay? Ibabalik lang po muna tayo dun sa understanding nyo na ang equity na pinag-uusapan natin dito is yung kinasanayan yung capital. Yun po yun. Let's now talk about the elements of financial performance, which is income and expenses. Kasi minsan sa lalim ng terminology na ginagamit sa framework, baka nalilito kayo, naaalis yung perspective nyo. Actually, yung mga baby steps na nangyari sa inyo nung senior high na, income kasi, kaya nagkaka-income kasi nagbebenta ng goods or nagre-render ng services. Yun yung mga ways for an entity to earn income, to earn revenue. Yun pa rin yun. Wag nyong tatanggalin yun, no? Expenses, nagbabayad tayo ng rent, nagbabayad tayo ng salaries, and then we also recognize depreciation expenses and stuff. Wag nyo rin tatanggalin yun. It's just that we are formally defining it here using the framework's definitions. Pero wag nyo aalisin yun, yung mga foundational learning nyo na ganun. Yun pa rin naman to. Okay? Income is increases in assets or decreases in liabilities that result in increases in equity other than those relating to contributions from holders of equity claims. Kasi po, yung mga contributions from holders of equity claims, it's more of an equity transaction that affects the statement of changes in equity. So, Kung hindi po ganun yung transaction, then it is an income. Pero yung sinasabi lang naman po natin dito na income is the things that you know about how to earn revenue. Yun po yun. Okay? Don't stress yourself on this definition. That's it. Okay? And also, expenses, decreases in assets or increases in liabilities that result in decreases in equity other than those relating to distributions to holders of equity claims. Kanina nabanggit ko sa inyo yung dividends. So sabi dito, since hindi daw po, ang expense daw po is hindi related dun sa mga distributions to holders of equity claims natin, it follows that yung dividends po natin, hindi siya expenses. Yun po yun, yung sinasabi dyan. Pero yung knowledge po ninyo ng expenses, the salary expense, rent expense, depreciation expense, utilities expense, telecommunication, water, power, gas, yun. Yun yung expenses na alam nyo. At ito po yun. Okay? Which is represented by what? Decreases in assets. Increases in liabilities. Saan nagre-resulta? Decreases in equity. Kaya nga po, in your basic accounting classes, net income is added to capital in your capital statement, or in case of net loss, it's deducted to capital. Yun po yun. Kaya sinasabi dito na income is an increase in equity. Expense is decrease in equity. It's the thing that you do in senior high school. In your capital statement, net income, you add it to capital. In case of net loss, you deduct it to capital. Okay? It follows from these definitions of income and expense that contributions from holders of equity claims are not income and distributions to holders of equity claims are not expenses. O, ni-reiterate din pala sa inyo ng framework. Okay? Income and expenses are elements of financial statements that relate to an entity's financial performance. That's why an entity's income statement and the corresponding statement of comprehensive income represents the entity's financial performance. Okay? Different transactions and other events generate income and expenses with different characteristics. Providing information separately about income and expenses with different characteristics can help users of financial statements to understand the entity's financial performance, which boils down to the concept of understandability. Kaya dapat po natin yung gawin. Okay, that's actually the end of our discussion. Pero sabi ko nga po sa inyo, let's test your knowledge on the things that we have discussed. So, meron po ulit tayong 5-item quiz for this lesson. Okay? Ganun po uli ang setup, multiple choice. No? Para masanay na po kayong mag-answer ng accounting examination style ng quizzes or exams. Number 1. Which of the following statements is incorrect? A, B, C, D. Pakibasa po muna. Pause the video if you need more time and play it again when you're ready. Okay, so what is the incorrect statement here? The incorrect statement is letter B. Basahin natin. To help users of financial statements to identify and assess changes and trends, financial statements also provide comparative information for at least 2 preceding reporting periods. The framework tells us that as a minimum, at least 1 preceding reporting period. Baka malito kayo kasi sinabi dito, 2 preceding reporting periods. Tas naalala nyo sinabi ko kanina, sabi ni sir, 2022 financial statements, kailangan may 2021. So, ang bilang nyo, 2. Nabasa nyo 2. So, para sa inyo, tama ito. So, hindi nyo mahanap ngayon yung incorrect. Yan. Medyo tricky sa wording, yung mga accounting examinations natin. Ingat kayo sa ganon. You really have to analyze. So, for this one, ang sabi po sa atin ng framework is at least 1 preceding reporting period. 1 preceding lang. 1 before. So, 2022, ano yung 1 before niya? 2021. Yun po. Kaya, that made choice B as the incorrect statement. Okay? Ganun po yun, ha? Question number 2. Statement 1, financial statements provide information about transactions or other events viewed from the perspective of the reporting entity as a whole. And then statement 2, a reporting entity can be a single entity or a portion of an entity or can comprise more than one entity. A, B, C, D. Pause the video if you need more time and play it again when you're ready. The correct answer is Yes, tama. Hindi ka nagkakamali. Pareho naman siyang true. Sabi po natin, we present our financial statements on the perspective of the main character, di ba? Which is the reporting entity, not on the perspective of investors, of creditors, and stuff. Okay? And then, statement 2, a reporting entity can be a single entity or portion of an entity or can comprise more than one entity. Di ba? Pinag-usapan nga natin yung it's either a separate FS only of one company or hindi po kay consolidated FS ng parent-subsidiary relationship. Di ba? So, both statements are true. Number 3. Which of the following is not a criteria for a liability to exist? A, B, C, D. Pause the video if you need more time and play it again when you're ready. The correct answer is, or basically, what is not the criteria for a liability to exist? Letter B. For a liability to exist, kailangan the entity has an obligation. The obligation is to transfer an economic resource, and the obligation is a present obligation that exists as a result of past events. Yung sinasabi po natin control, that is actually an aspect of what? An asset. Because an asset, or the entity rather, should have control over those economic resources. Hindi control over the liability. Okay? So that's not the criteria for a liability to exist. Question number 4. Which of the following statements is incorrect? A, B, C, and D. Pause the video if you need more time and play it again when you're ready. So the incorrect statement is letter D. Equity claims are claims on the residual interest in the assets of the entity after deducting all its liabilities, not expenses. Okay? So terminology tweak lang yan. Ingat kayo sa ganyan, maraming ganyan sa accounting questions. Okay? Tinweak ko lang ng konti, baka nalito na iba sa inyo. So, it made actually the statement wrong already. Isa lang binago ko, di ba? So, ingat sa ganon. Okay? Last question, question number 5. Which of the following statements is correct about assets? So, correct naman po yung hinahanap natin ngayon. 3 ang incorrect, 1 ang correct. So, pag diniscuss natin yung correct, iisa-isahin po natin at itatama yung mga naging incorrect statements. Pause the video if you need more time and play it again when you're ready. The correct statement is D. An economic resource is a right that has the potential to produce economic benefits. For that potential to exist, it does not need to be certain or even likely that the right will produce economic benefits. Now, what made A, B, and C wrong? Letter A. Assets and its definition revolve around 3 aspects: the right, potential for an outflow of economic benefits, and control. Ano po bang sinabi natin? Potential for what? Diba? May ine-expect po tayong inflow of economic benefits. So, ang outflow of economic benefits relates more to what? Liabilities. Letter B, rights to receive goods or services refer to the entity's control over its economic resources. Hindi. Ang right at saka control are separate aspects of asset. Okay? Kaya siya mali. Okay? And then letter C, an entity has a right to an economic resource if it has the present ability to direct the use of economic resource and obtain the economic benefits that may flow from it. Hindi po yan right. Yan po yung sinasabi nating control aspect naman, no, ng assets. Ayan. So, yun ha. So, ingat din sa mga multiple choice questions kung ang hinahanap ay correct statement or incorrect statement. So, I know for some of you, chicken na lang yung mga ganyan, no? Pero, reminder lang, syempre, para sa lahat, pag correct statement ang hinahanap, 3 yung mali, hanapin nyo yung tama. Okay? Kapag incorrect statement naman po yung hinahanap, hanapin nyo yung incorrect kasi yung 3 naman tama. Okay? So, that's it for today. Maraming salamat for being with us today. And our next lesson is a continuation still of the Conceptual Framework for Financial Reporting, Part 3. Again, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell button, and comment down your questions, suggestions, and reactions for this video. This has been Sir Chua's Accounting Lessons PH. To God be all the glory, honor, and praise. Thank you, and have a great day, and thank you. Thank you so much. Nagbakal pa sa dulo. Thank you.
forever.